Okay, so this week we're going to look at externalities. Here's the first activity. Give real-world examples you've seen of a negative production externality and a negative consumption externality. So that's something you can do for yourself. Here's just a few examples to illustrate the point. So this would be an example of a negative externality of production. Obviously, this is a case of producing a good or service, and in the process of doing that, it creates an external effect. That is, it affects others who have nothing to do with this production process whatsoever. And it affects them negatively. That is, they experience costs because of this production activity, due to the pollution chiefly. So, for example, it increases people's health costs in the surrounding area, for example. Here's another one. So this is deforestation of the Amazon rainforest, commonly termed the lungs of the planet. So by deforestation, there's a side effect on bystanders or people who are external to the process. This process is it's about production, so it's the production of wood products. The side effect is that it contributes to global warming and climate change, and so that harms other people, increases the costs that other people will experience ultimately. So this is a negative externality of production. Here's a negative externality of consumption. So this is not about the production of goods, but rather about people consuming goods, and then the goods come in various kinds of wrappers and so on, and then people just throw them away, litter, and it creates a garbage beach like this, which is unpleasant, to say the least, to people who are not involved in the consumption of any of this stuff that we see on the beach here. People are nonetheless negatively affected by that. So this is a negative externality of consumption. If we took the example of guns in the United States, say, then this is about the negative externality of gun consumption or use. So we can see there that in the United States, there are people who get killed by firearms that had nothing to do with the use or the consumption of the firearm itself. This presumably is a negative externality in that there are bystanders or people who are external to the market being killed for that. And lucky last, this is an example where you might have its externalities of production and consumption combined. So there's the externalities of production. Presumably there's factories in this area that produce pollution, but simultaneously there's the consumption of, or the use of, trucks and cars, which also contributes to pollution. So this combination of production and consumption creates this city smog. So on the following graphs of a perfectly competitive market, so here we're talking about supply-demand, basically. We want to show the free market price and quantity, and the efficient price and quantity or output. So efficient here, remember, will mean allocatively efficient. And what does allocatively efficient mean? It means the output, the allocation of resources such that the output being produced generates a marginal social benefit that just equals the marginal social cost. So first we want the we're going to look at the example of, say, pollution, where we have a negative externality of production. So the free market outcome is going to be simply at the equilibrium point, where the private quantity demanded equals the private quantity supplied. Now, this is inefficient because we haven't taken account of the negative externality of production. If we add the negative externality of production on top of the private costs, then we would have a curve, for example, like this. It doesn't have to look like this, I've just drawn it like this. This is reflecting the fact that as production increases, I've drawn it so that the negative external effect, the negative external cost experienced by others, gets larger and larger and larger. The marginal external effect gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The larger the amount of production, the bigger the negative external effect. So if we included to the private costs, we included the negative external costs, then the marginal social cost curve would be up here. So what's the optimal output and price? It will be where the marginal social benefit equals the marginal social cost, which is not here. We can see that that's not occurring at the moment. The marginal social cost of producing 4 million litres, the marginal social cost is clearly greater than the marginal social benefit. Where they would be equal would be here. This would be the efficient quantity and price, the allocatively efficient quantity and price. That's the answer to that question. What about if we took a case of a negative externality of consumption, such as garbage or littering? So we've got the marginal costs, and we're saying there are no externalities associated with the production of the products, whatever they are. But there is a negative externality associated with the consumption of the product or the use of the product. So this is the private benefit, the marginal private benefit experienced by the consumers of the products, reflecting a demand curve. But that's not taking account of the negative external effects on others in the form of littering by the consumers. So if we took that into account, then the marginal benefit curve would be lower. The benefit to the society overall is less than the benefit to the private consumers. Anyway, the free market outcome is simply going to be where the private supply equals the private demand, this equilibrium point here. Price of $1, 4 million litres. But that's not the socially optimal outcome. The socially optimal outcome is where the marginal social benefit equals the marginal social cost. That is, the cost of the last unit to the society equals the benefit to the last unit to society. So it's obviously not happening here. We can see that the marginal social cost is $1, but the marginal social benefit is much less than that. So this outcome is not, that we have here, this free market outcome, is not an efficient allocation. Rather, it should be here. 2 million litres per month, because it's at this point that the marginal social benefit equals the marginal social cost. What about government intervention? How could a government bring about the efficient price and output in the above markets? Well, I'm just going to look at one example, but these are the things governments could do. They could engage in taxation, they could engage in private property rights allocation, they could have production quotas, or they could provide incentives for new technology and products to change either the entire way in which production occurs, or to produce entirely new kinds of products which don't generate the externalities. We're just going to look at the first couple. So let's say we can impose a tax. So this would be taxing a negative externality of production. It's called a Pigouvian tax after Arthur Cecil Pigou, who came up with it. So we've got our initial equilibrium point, but what the government notices is that as output increases from small amounts, the amount supplied increases by a small amount, the external effect on others gets larger. Right? So the government calculates what those external effects are on the general public who has nothing to do with the production of the product, and then imposes, it says, we're going to impose a tax on the production of this product at whatever level you produce. If you produce a small amount where there's a small external effect, we're going to charge you a small tax equal to the size of that external effect. If you produce a lot where there's a large negative external effect, we're going to charge you a large tax equal to the size of that external effect. What's basically happening here is that the government is saying not only does this firm have to pay the costs of producing the product, whatever it happens to be, the land, labour, capital costs, but in addition to those costs, they also have to pay for the cost borne by other people who are external to the market, and they pay that cost by means of a tax. So the tax is now added to the costs of the private firms, and that means that the marginal cost curves of the private firms gets pushed upwards by the value of the tax, which is simultaneously the value of the externalities at each level of output. Now, where will the market choose to produce at? Well, it's going to produce at the point where the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost, which they now have to pay because of the tax being imposed. So that's $1.50. All right. By the way, that's the government revenue that would be collected at that level, because the tax is going to be the external. By producing 2 units, there's an externality generated, right, of this much, right? So it's of that much generated is 60 cents per unit, right? 60 cents per unit. Right, 150 minus 90, 60 cents per unit. And the government, therefore, says, all right, you're going to produce at that level. We're taxing you at 60 cents per unit. Right? So 60 cents per unit tax multiplied by 2 million units gives you this area here as the tax revenue. Right? 60 cents per unit times 2 million units. This area is total revenue. It's the government revenue. The government is not imposing the tax to collect revenue. The government imposed the tax in order to compel the firms to start producing at the most allocatively efficient outcome. Okay? What about private compensation payment for a negative externality of production? So this is what's sometimes called a Coase Theorem solution, in which you don't have government imposing tax. What instead you have is that the government rather allocates private property rights over the resource that's being used by both parties, by the bystanders or the people who are affected, and the producers, the factory owners, say. And in this story, let's say that the government allocates rights over, say, the air or the water or whatever it is that's being polluted to the bystanders, to the people who are negatively affected, the externally affected party. In that case, then what you do is you simply have the parties haggling with each other, because, say, for example, the producers, they want to produce goods, and therefore they're going to generate, say, pollution. So they want to produce goods, but they don't want to have to pay an exorbitantly high price to engage in pollution. So let's say they started off, the suppliers started off saying, okay, we're going to produce at the free market equilibrium point of 4 million. The third party, that is the bystanders or the people who are negatively affected, who have nothing to do with this, they say, all right, well, we're being negatively affected by this much due to your production. So we want to be compensated by that much. We're not giving you access to the land or to the air or to the waterways or whatever it is that's being polluted until you compensate us by this much, the value of the external negative effect we're experiencing. And you can see there that that's not a good deal for the producers, because the cost to them is now going to be $2.25, and the benefit that would be generated by the sale of the product, by the demand, is going to be $1, right? So they would really make losses out of that. So they're not going to produce at 4 million. Think, all right, how about we produce at 3 million? And the owners of the land or the forest or the river or whatever it is, or the air, they say, all right, well, we're experiencing a negative externality of this much now by this. So you have to pay us this much. And would the owners accept that? Well, no, because they would have to pay this price up here, but the benefit received, or the revenue they would collect from the buyers in the price that they're charging, is down here. So they'd be making a loss on the 3 millionth litre. All right, so that's not a good deal for them either. So they say, all right, we produce here. At this point, the people who are negatively affected say, all right, well, in that case, we'll experience this much negative externality. We want to be compensated for that. We'll let you use the river or the air or whatever, as long as you compensate us to the value of this external effect that you're imposing. Will the firms accept this outcome? Well, yes. It's at a limit, but they will accept it, because the revenue or the marginal benefit from the last unit, the 2 millionth unit, is just equal to the cost they're now experiencing. Their private cost plus the compensation they have to pay is just equal to that. Okay? At this point, they would be willing to produce 2 million and pay the third party compensation for that. Now, that's all done without any government intervention. That's just haggling between the owners of the resource which is being utilized or exploited or whatever, and which is harming the third party, and the producers of the product. So you can see that we still get the same allocatively efficient outcome, except that it's through private haggling over property rights.